So the choice of recommended pivot tables given to you by Excel is not what you're after. You'd like to create a pivot table yourself. Let's follow the steps. So firstly, you need some data. Let's take the Sales Inc. 2013 file. We don't need to highlight the data unless there is a totally blank column or a totally blank row inside your data that would effectively stop Excel from selecting the whole data. Without a blank column or row, we're fine to not select anything. We just click in, we can be anywhere. Then we go to Insert. We are not going to go down the recommended route, we're going to create our own pivot table. Excel then highlights the data, so select a table or range, and it should automatically pick up the whole range. So we can see it's picking up from the sales data sheet A1 all the way through to I466. Where would you like to put the pivot table? In a new worksheet or in the existing worksheet? Well, I would certainly always recommend placing the pivot table in its own worksheet so that it doesn't interact with the data that you're basing it on. And then OK. Now what we get is we get a little rectangle where the pivot table will start from. On the right, we get the pivot table fields. Now this is how you're going to build your pivot table. This top little section here lists all of your columns that you have in your data. And then the bottom half are the sections of the pivot table. So the values is the crossover of the rows and the columns, and it works out the values. The rows are the row headings, the columns are the column headings, and then the filter section is that filter above the pivot table that we've seen in action. The only bit really that you need to make anything work is the values section. So if we were to take one of our fields here, let's say the current quantity, and move that, so we grab it and drag it and drop it in the values section, you can see that it sums the cur QTY. And over in the left, we see our pivot table, sum of cur QTY, 647 items we've sold. Then we'd like to break that down into different sections, different groups, different months. So let's scroll down to month name, take all of month name, and let's drop that in the row section. And what we get is a separate row for each unique value in that column. There are only 12 months in the year, we get 12 rows, titled up January, February, March, all the way through to December. And then the value section is now divided up between each of those separate groups, so each of the months. We still have the same grand total, 647. Now if we wanted to then place one of our other columns into the column section, so let's take the town, drop that into the columns, you see we then get one column for each town. And that really breaks the data down because lots of 1s and 2s and 3s in there. But we have the crisscross taking place now. So the pivot section really. So the months are down the left, the towns are across the top. And where the column and the row meet, we get a value, if there are any values. So August in London is 1, April in Abingdon is 1, September in Aylesbury is 11. And you can do that with any of your data values. So you simply select the field here, drop it into either the columns or the rows, and each unique value in that particular column will become a heading. So either a column heading or a row heading. If you drop a field into the value section, if it's numerical, it will assume that you want to sum that value. So it will sum that value, but grouping it either by row or column or both if you use both. If you drop a text field into there, it will assume you wish to count the values. So there are two different assumptions that Excel will make with its pivot table there, between sum for numeric fields and count for text fields. But apart from that, your pivot table works. Now if you have chosen the wrong fields by accident or dropped it into the wrong section by accident, we simply drag it out. So if you don't want the town in the columns, you can grab hold of it, drag it back to the field list, and you'll see you've got a little cross there. So when you let go, it removes it as a column heading. Maybe we would like the month names to be column headings instead of row headings. Well, again, we can grab the value, drop it in the columns, and we get column headings for each of the months. In which case, we could then perhaps drag the items into the rows. And then we get a different row for each item. So you can see that the data in your pivot table is held in the sales data sheet, but we can interrogate it interactively. It's very easy to grab a field, drag it out. So you can experiment. I don't want the item title, thank you. I would like the month name to be in the rows. I don't want to sum the cur quantity. I want to count the item titles. So I drop that into there. You can see it reverts to count because it's a text field. So it can't sum the text field, but it can count them. And therefore it's counting the number of items for each month, as opposed to the total quantity of each item. So we've got 465 different items. But if we drop the quantity in as well, because we can add more than one value into there, you see it needs to then scroll between, and that sums the quantity. So there are 17 different items, but 20 total items sold in January. And in November, 180 total items, but there are 134 different ones because we've counted the item titles. When we dropped the cur quantity into the value section so that it could sum it, it also placed as a little column heading here because it's created two columns for the hash values, which is why it's put the little sigma values. Very dynamic, very easy to do. You start with your data, insert a pivot table, and then you effectively experiment to start with till you're happy with the data, dragging different fields into different sections. Any field in the row section will create a separate row for each unique value in that column. The same for the columns. Every field you add into there will create a new column for each unique value. Drop values into the center bit, the values, and it will sum for numeric fields and it will count for text fields. And you're off and away with pivot tables.